Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to follow one unforgettable countryside day when CEO Minh gets attacked by fire ants in a lychee orchard, accidentally calls Thuong his wife at the market, and ends the night with a gift that quietly opens the door to a whole new future together. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The morning came softly to the orchard, slipping through the lychee branches in pale gold ribbons and settling over the damp earth like a blessing. Dew still clung to the leaves, catching the first light in tiny flashes, and the air carried that unmistakable countryside mix of wet soil, tree sap, and ripe fruit. Somewhere above, birds were already calling to each other, lively and unashamed, as if they had never known a day that began with anything but joy. Minh stood beneath the old lychee trees in a brown baba outfit that still looked strange on him, no matter how naturally he tried to wear it. The loose clothes softened him somehow, stripped away the sharpness people usually saw first in the city. But the difference was still there in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes assessed everything around him, in the faint awkwardness of a man who has spent years closing contracts worth millions and had only recently begun learning how to move through a fruit orchard without looking like he was entering a boardroom by mistake. A conical hat sat low on his head, slightly crooked. He reached toward a heavy cluster of lychees hanging just above eye level and narrowed his gaze with the kind of determination he usually reserved for negotiations. The fruit looked easy enough to pick. It wasn't. The moment his fingers brushed too deeply into the branch, the tree answered him. A line of angry fire ants rushed from a hidden crevice and onto the back of his hand with shocking speed. Minh recoiled instantly. Ow! The word came out sharper than he meant it to. His hand jerked back. The conical hat slipped from his head and tumbled to the ground near his feet. He stared at his hand in offended disbelief. The calm authority of a CEO vanishing in one humiliating, stinging second. Nearby, Thuong had seen everything. She tried to hold it in. She really did. But the sight of him face tensed, brows drawn together, hat on the ground, expression caught between pain and confusion was too much. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Not cruel laughter, not mocking, soft, bright, clear as wind through leaves. Minh looked at her. That only made her laugh harder. For 1 second, he seemed almost ready to defend his dignity. Then he looked down at his own hand again, and whatever argument he might have made dissolved into a sigh. Thuong stepped toward him, the smile still alive on her lips, and gently took his hand before he could pull it away. The contact silenced them both. It lasted only a second, maybe two. But in that brief pause, the whole orchard seemed to shift around them. Her fingers were cool from the morning air. His skin was warm. She turned his hand carefully to inspect the bites, brows knitting with real concern now. You disturbed their home, she said softly, still smiling a little. Minh let out a breath. I noticed. Thuong lowered his hand slightly and blew over the reddening spots, her breath warm and gentle against the skin. It was such a small thing, the kind of instinctive care people don't think about before doing. And yet the sensation traveled far beyond the ant bites. Minh felt it in his chest first, then deeper, somewhere he had no language for. He didn't move. Neither did she. Their eyes lifted at almost the same moment and met in the broken light beneath the trees. Sunbeam slipped through the canopy and moved across her face, across his shoulder, across the ground between them. For that brief, suspended instant, the world outside the orchard seemed to fall away entirely. No company, no staff, no city, no expectations. Just two people in the middle of a lychee grove, held together by a mistake, a laugh, and an act of care so simple it became unforgettable. Thuong kept one hand around his, still protective, and blew again lightly over the bites. You'll live, she murmured. Minh almost smiled. Good, I was worried. That drew another small laugh from her, softer this time. By the time the baskets were full, the morning had ripened into something warmer. The orchard was no longer silver with dew, but alive with sunlight, scent, and the low rustle of work finishing. The lychees lay piled high in woven baskets, their skins flushed red and textured like tiny lanterns. They began the walk to market soon after. It was not far, but the road wound through the countryside in that slow, patient way village roads always do. Men wheeled an old bicycle, with the baskets tied carefully on either side. The metal frame rattled lightly over the red dirt path, and the chain made a regular clinking sound that somehow matched the rhythm of their steps. Thuong walked beside him, barefoot, as she often did on familiar roads. Her feet knew this ground in a way his never would. The path curved past rice fields so green they almost looked painted, and the morning breeze moved across them in waves, making the whole land seem alive. Farmers passed from the opposite direction, greeting Thuong with easy familiarity and giving Minh those curious side glances reserved for strangers who did not seem to belong and yet somehow had ended up exactly where they were. Minh noticed the looks. He didn't mind them. In fact, he felt strangely free beneath them. There was no suit today, no polished shoes, no tinted car window separating him from other people's assumptions. The wind touched his face directly. Dust settled on his sleeves. The baskets were heavy, and the road demanded attention from his body rather than his mind. It was exhausting in a clean, honest way. For once, every problem in front of him could be solved with hands, balance, and effort. As they drew closer to the market, the stillness of the orchard gave way to another kind of energy. Voices rose from ahead. The smell changed vegetables, fish, herbs, warm earth, charcoal smoke. The road widened slightly, and with it the world returned, full of barter, gossip, laughter, and all the rough beauty of daily life. They found a small corner without much trouble. Minh set down the baskets, unfolded a low wooden stool, and sat with the seriousness of a man beginning an unexpectedly important task. Thuong stood just behind him at first, watching with barely hidden amusement as he arranged the fruit like he was preparing a product launch. It did not take long for people to notice him. First one woman, then another, then three at once. The market had seen plenty of sellers, but not many who looked like Minh's sharp-boned face, city manner still clinging to him in little ways, eyes too observant to fully pass for a village man, and yet dressed in simple brown clothes while sitting in the dust, selling lychees like he had always done it. Curiosity spread quickly. A pair of housewives slowed near the stall. One of them looked at the fruit, then at Minh, then back at the fruit again, as if deciding which was more unusual. "Are the lychees sweet?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was more interested in hearing him answer than in the fruit itself. Minh picked one up, held it like evidence, and said, "Yes, very sweet." The woman grinned. "How do you know?" He hesitated just long enough to make Thuong bite back a smile. "Because..." He looked down at the basket, then back up. "Because they were picked carefully." The women laughed. Another asked the price. A third wanted to know if he had weighed them properly. Minh reached for the small bills in his lap and nearly dropped half of them while trying to calculate change. The heat rose quickly under his collar, and the growing circle of amused customers only made him more aware of himself. Then came the mistake. An elderly woman holding a cloth shopping bag picked up a fruit and asked, "Will these be sweet enough for my grandchildren?" Minh, flustered and trying too hard to sound natural, nodded and said, "Yes, very sweet. Please buy some for my wife." He stopped. Too late. The women around the stall burst into laughter so loud it rippled through the market. Thuong lowered her head immediately, one hand flying to her mouth in a helpless attempt to hide the smile spreading across her face. Her cheeks flushed pink. Minh closed his eyes briefly like a man watching his own dignity walk calmly away from him. "I mean," he corrected, "far too late to recover anything. For your family." But no one was listening anymore. The stall had become a small source of entertainment, and somehow that only made people buy faster. Within 15 minutes, both baskets were empty. Minh sat there afterward with a stack of warm, slightly damp bills in his hand and stared at the bare baskets like he had just witnessed a magic trick performed at his own expense. Sung Thuong looked at him with such open delight and pride that he couldn't even pretend to be annoyed. "Sold out," she said softly. "So I see." They packed up together while the laughter of the market still floated around them. And in that noisy, dusty place, with no titles left between them and no distance strong enough to matter, Min realized something simple and unsettling. He had not felt this light in a very long time. The stall was empty, and yet Min still sat there for a few seconds, as if the lychees might somehow reappear if he stared hard enough. The little wooden stool creaked under him. His hand was still wrapped around the stack of small bills, warm now from his grip and the heat of the market. He looked from the money to the baskets, then up at Sung Thuong, who was watching him with a smile she was no longer trying to hide. There was pride in that smile, real pride. Not because he had sold fruit quickly, because he had tried. Because he had stepped into her world without mocking it, without turning it into a game, and somehow, even in all his awkwardness, he had stayed sincere. "You sold everything," she said. Min looked down at the empty baskets again, then let out a breath that was half laugh, half surrender. Apparently, the laughter of the women nearby was still drifting through the market, softer now, but still close enough that he knew the phrase, "buy some for my wife," would likely survive in local memory far longer than he deserved. Sung Thuong bent to lift one of the empty baskets. Min took it from her automatically. "I can carry these," he said. She didn't argue. That, more than anything, told him how much had shifted between them already. They began walking through the market together. Slower this time. No longer sellers, but simply two people moving side by side through color and noise and sun-warmed dust. The money from the lychees sat folded in Min's hand, and he kept glancing at it as if it might disappear. He had handled transactions bigger than this before breakfast on ordinary workdays, but none of those numbers had ever felt like this. This money had weight, not because of the amount, because of how it was earned. They stopped first at a vegetable stall where bunches of morning glory, herbs, and scallions were laid out in damp green piles. Sung Thuong crouched slightly to inspect the freshness with the ease of someone who had done this all her life. Min watched her fingers move over the greens, testing, choosing, rejecting without offense. There was something deeply attractive in the certainty of that. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she never needed to announce it. "Enough for tonight?" he asked. She looked up. "If you want to eat, I would prefer that." That earned him a small sideways smile. They bought fish next, then spices, then a few odds and ends she insisted would be useful later. Min paid each vendor with the same careful seriousness he had brought to selling the lychees. Once, when an older woman handed him too much change back by accident, he stopped her immediately and corrected it. She looked at him in surprise, then at Sung Thuong, and gave them both a smile full of meanings neither of them chose to name. By the time they left the market, the light had begun to slope lower. The road home felt different from the road there. Not quieter exactly, more intimate. They had something now the morning version of themselves had not carried, a shared success, ridiculous and small and perfect in its own way. Min balanced the produce on the bicycle while Sung Thuong walked beside him. Once or twice, their arms brushed. Once, when the path narrowed around a muddy stretch, she reached lightly for his sleeve without thinking, then let go immediately. He said nothing, but the place where she touched him seemed to stay alert long after. Back at the house, the late afternoon light had turned warm and slanting, spilling across the porch and into the small kitchen in a way that made even the chipped bowls look precious. The whole place smelled faintly of wood smoke and green leaves. Min set the baskets down and rolled up his sleeves. That made Sung Thuong pause in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Helping," he said, as if the answer were obvious. "You don't have to." "I know." And that was the end of the argument. He stepped into the kitchen like a man entering a room he had every intention of learning properly. It was a cramped space, low-roofed and warm, with a clay stove in one corner and simple shelves along the wall. Nothing about it belonged to the life he had once considered normal. And yet he moved into it with a quiet eagerness that made Sung Thuong's chest tighten for reasons she did not want to examine too closely. She cleaned the fish while he washed vegetables and tried, with increasing concentration, to pick morning glory leaves while stripping the tougher stems. His fingers were far too precise at first, as if he believed every stalk required engineering-level attention. The result was so earnest it nearly made her laugh. "Not like that," she said, moving closer. "Here." She took one stem from his hand and showed him how to bend and strip it in one quick motion. He watched closely, then tried again. Better this time. "See?" she said. Min lifted an eyebrow. "So there is hope for me." "A little," he smiled. The fish began to braise in the clay pot, and the smell rose slowly savory, warm, touched with pepper and shallot. Steam drifted up and curled against the dimming light. As Sung Thuong stirred the sauce, Min leaned too close to the stove while reaching for a lid and came back with a dark streak of soot right across the middle of his forehead. She turned, saw it, and froze for half a second. Then she burst into laughter. Not the soft market laughter. This was fuller, helpless, bright enough to fill the whole kitchen. Min frowned at first, confused, then saw his reflection in the metal pot lid and let out a disbelieving laugh of his own. "What now?" he said. She managed between laughs. "You look like you fought the stove and lost." He wiped at his forehead, only making the smear worse. "That helps," she said dryly, still smiling. The two of them stood there laughing, in the kitchen smoke, while the fish simmered and the vegetables waited. And for one perfect, ridiculous stretch of time, the world outside ceased to matter. Not his position, not her past, not whatever other people might say if they saw them. In that cramped, soot-warmed room, they were simply two people making dinner together. When the laughter settled, a softer quiet took its place. Sung Thuong looked at him, and something in her expression changed. He saw it. Not fully understood, perhaps, but recognized. The wall between them had not vanished, but it had become thinner, more human, no longer built from status, but from the ordinary fear of wanting something fragile too much. Dinner was ready just as the sky turned from rose to violet. They carried everything out to the porch, where the evening breeze moved freely through the open space, and the first crickets had started their low, persistent chorus. The table was small, the meal simple braised fish, boiled greens, white rice, a little bowl of sauce, but after the day they had shared, it felt complete in a way far more extravagant meals often did not. For a while, they ate quietly. The fish was tender, the greens still bright. The food tasted like labor, heat, laughter, smoke, and the market road still warm under the sun. Min found himself slowing down just to stay in the moment longer. Sung Thuong ate with the calm focus of someone who had worked all day and knew how to be grateful for a meal without ceremony. Then Min reached into his pocket. The movement was small, almost hesitant. He drew out a compact, elegant box and placed it on the table between them. Sung Thuong stared at it. For one absurd second, her heartbeat turned wild. The porch, the moonlight beginning to rise, the long day, the strange tenderness of everything, they all rushed together and made her mind leap somewhere foolish and bright. Min saw the look in her eyes and nearly smiled before she even opened it. She lifted the lid. Inside was not a ring, it was a professional camera. For a second, she simply looked at it, not understanding, then understanding too quickly, too fully. She touched it with both hands like it might vanish if she didn't. "I want you to use this," Min said. His voice had dropped lower, steadier. "To record your baking journey. The world should see your sweetness too, not just me." The words landed deep. Sung Thuong's throat tightened. Not because the gift was expensive, though she knew it was. Because he had seen something in her worthy of being shown to the world. Not rescued, not hidden, shown. Her eyes filled, and she lowered them quickly. Then, almost immediately, she stood and went inside. Min stayed still, waiting. A few moments later, she returned holding two things: a sturdy sun protection jacket neatly folded, and a glass jar of premium bath salts wrapped carefully in cloth. She set them down in front of him and smiled with a shyness that still somehow carried mischief. "I want you to protect your skin," she said, "because from now on, you'll be coming to the fields with me much more." Min looked from the jacket to her face and then down again. The gift itself was practical, almost modest. The meaning behind it was not. This was not only care, it was inclusion. A place being made for him in her future, using the language she trusted most. Useful things, thoughtful things, things meant to survive heat and work and ordinary days. He looked up at her slowly. "So, that's your plan?" She nodded once. "If you can survive ants and soot, maybe." He laughed under his breath. Above them, the sky had darkened properly now. Stars were beginning to appear one by one over the trees. The crickets had grown louder. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. They looked at each other across the small porch table, gifts between them, dinner half finished, the whole day behind them glowing in memory. Neither said anything more for a while. They didn't need to. The meaning had already settled where it needed to. A new road had opened, not dramatic, not announced, but real. And under the night sky, with a scent of fish and leaves and wood smoke still lingering in the air, both of them knew it had begun. On a peaceful morning in the lychee orchard, CEO Min steps into countryside life with more sincerity than skill, and quickly learns that picking fruit is not as easy as it looks when fire ants attack his hand. Thuong gently tends to him, and that small moment of care opens a deeper closeness between them. Together, they take the lychees to the local market, where Min awkwardly becomes the center of attention and accidentally refers to Thuong as his wife, making the entire market burst into laughter. Their fruit sells out almost instantly, and the simple success fills them both with a joy that feels more meaningful than money. Back home, they cook dinner side by side, laughing over his clumsy kitchen mistakes and sharing an ease that feels increasingly natural. Later, under the evening sky, Min gives Thuong a professional camera to support her baking journey, while she gives him practical gifts that quietly invite him deeper into her everyday world and future.